we arrived in Harare, the person who owned the house next to where we eventually lived was a guy called Trevor Jones, and in 1936, Trevor Jones wrote this paper in which he spoke about the Sterkfontein Caves, and his father lived on a farm right next to the Sterkfontein Caves. And when he was doing his bachelor's degree at the University of Witwatersrand, he went to his professor and he said, I think you should go and look at the Sterkfontein Caves for fossils, for African fossils of primates. And here he is, and he spoke to Raymond Dart, and Raymond Dart was the first person in the world to discover the original primate or pre-hominid that was discovered in Africa. And this is not the one, but this is the most famous fossil that ever came from Sterkfontein. It's called Mrs. Ples, and she's 2.1 million years old, and she stood 3 foot tall. So that's how tall we were 2 million years ago. And here is Raymond Dart, and Raymond Dart then was the first person to say that humans evolved in Africa. And his prize for saying that was he went mad. For 20 years, the world said, you're impossible. We know that Java and the East, that's where exotic things happen. Nothing exotic happens in Africa. And so he went slightly mad, but he noticed one observation. And it was the original Taung skull, which came from the Northern Cape. And he noticed the foramen magnum was horizontal. So he said this animal walked upright and was therefore not a primate, was a pre-hominid. And he was correct, and this is considered one of the 20 most famous discoveries in science of the 20th century. So this is what we looked like 2.1 million years ago, and we were vegetarian at that time, an occasional meat eater. These animals were already catching some form of meat, but they were made predominantly vegetarian. And that's what we are today. And what we've learned in the last 20 or so years is that this change from vegetarian to omnivore came about because we're persistent hunters. We are the most effective midday hunters. And so the whole evolution of humans and the bodies that you deal with every day in your work is dependent on our ability to hunt large animals. And that began in Africa, and it was catching those large animals that allowed us to become big because we ate the protein and the fat. There is a crinkle to the story which is really interesting because you're in South Africa. But genetically, you know that all humans go back to a group who lived about 200,000 years ago. And so a guy from Arizona State decided if all humans were wiped out at 200,000 years ago, and there was only one population living, where would they be living? And he, through a whole bunch of analyses, decided they would be living near Mossel Bay on the South Cape coast. And he went and searched and found a cave which has been in continual habitation for the last 200,000 years, up till about 60,000 years ago. And so the one theory is that all humans were actually wiped out down to 600 breeding pairs, and that they then survived 200,000 years ago on the Southern Cape coast for various reasons why. But there they got hold of fish, particularly there was widespread fish availability. And the theory is that it was eating the fish that eventually allowed us to increase our brain size substantially in the last 200,000 years. So I'm not suggesting it's right, but it's a nice, interesting South African extension of the story. But the point being that we are basically long-distance runners. That's what we designed to do. And that allowed us to become what we are. Professor Christian Barnard influenced me. I was, in fact, in America studying as an exchange student, where on the day the world's first human heart transplant was performed. And that convinced me to study medicine. But he said most of us think along straight lines, like a bus or a train or a tram. If the destination isn't up on the board, few of us would know where we're going, and that applies even to scientific researchers who know much better. We tend to let tradition lead us by the nose. It takes an effort of will to break out of the mold. And you must understand that he was living in a very, very conservative society in Cape Town. And he made the break. And he decided that he was going to be the first in the world to do it. Despite the fact that there were surgeons in Stanford who were in advance of him, but he believed that he could do it, and for a number of reasons he was the first. Now, the reason why you go to university is to teach you how stupid we all are. That should be the focus of university education. And so I think that's what Willem was referring to. The greatest single achievement of science is the discovery that we are profoundly ignorant. And that's so terribly important, and I'm sure that's why you're all here to learn more. And I wish there was a formal course in medical school on medical ignorance. As you know, I've got a lot of interest in sport, but I know in sport, the moment you think you won, that's it, you're gone, you're finished. It's over. The game's over. And this is the truth. And then this is the Willem has referred to this. George Sheehan was a cardiologist in the United States and whose writing in the early 70s really influenced me. He became my guru. And he quoted the Dean of Harvard Medical School. My students are dismayed when I say to them, half of what you are taught as students will in 10 years have been shown to be wrong, and the trouble is none of our students know where. And that's been my philosophy, as Willem said. And it's terribly important because we tend to think we know it all, and that's a disaster. And I think the point is that we are all taught a major lie in our education. And the lie I was taught in medicine was that ulcers are caused by excessive acid secretion. Now maybe most of you are too young for that, but when I was a medical student, we operated on the stomachs to cut the nerves, to cut the acid secretion, because it wasn't possible for there to be bacteria causing the ulcers, because bacteria can't exist in the stomach. Bacteria can exist anywhere, but we were too stupid to know that. And along came this guy, Barry Marsh and Robin Warren. And Warren, I don't know if you know this story, that he found a new technique for a silver stain, and he started staining stomachs with ulcers. And he noticed there were always bacteria there. And he looked in the literature, and in fact it goes back to 1860 when it was first observed. And there's a long history, but it will be completely ignored. And Barry Marshall came along and wanted to do a master's degree, I think it was at the time. And he spoke to this madman, and he decided, well, maybe he's right. And eventually they won the Nobel Prize in 2005 for proving that Helicobacter caused gastric ulcers. But the point is, and I always say this, why didn't the guy at the University of Cape Town win this medal? Or in America? Why was it a guy in Australia? And the answer was because they were allowed to ask the questions. The people didn't say, this is the way it is, you may not answer. And I'm convinced that the surgeon that taught me would never have allowed us to ask that question. Never. So it couldn't have happened. But he was fortunate. So my point about Barry Marshall is every generation of medical students is taught at least one utterly wrong fable. And that's what we have to remember. And why do we teach fables? We teach fables because of a thing called groupthink. And Groupthink was written in a Fortune magazine article in 1952, and then this guy wrote a book. And what you can say about groupthink is a mode of thinking used by members of a cohesive in-group. His desire for unanimity overrides any motivation to appraise alternative courses of action. And now I'm going to be absolutely horrendously outspoken. And I'm going to say that what I understand in medicine is you've got two routes you can go in medicine. And please, I'm not saying orthopedic surgery, I'm saying medicine. Okay? You can either decide to find the truth, or you can become famous for the short term. If you want to become famous in the short term, you have to choose the group. And you have to become the professor's golden boy. And you have to say exactly what he says. And you have to think exactly as he thinks. And ultimately, you'll be successful, but you may be completely wrong. Because he could be completely wrong. Or else you choose the truth. And you just decide that's what I'm going to look for. And I think that I tell students, that's a choice you have to make. And the problem with what's happened today is if you want to go the first route or the second route, the pharmaceutical industry is going to have to support you. And the pharmaceutical industry is not interested in tricks, they're interested in what's going to sell their products. And that's where medicine is in real trouble globally, is we've allowed the pharmaceutical industry to direct us. And that's not always to our advantage. George Orwell said, anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy finds himself silenced with surprising effectiveness. A genuinely unfashionable opinion is almost never given a fair hearing. And he went further in 1984, and he said, the whole climate of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought as we understand it now. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. And that's what we have to go against in medicine, that's orthodoxy. And I'm very glad that I was able to convince Willem not to become orthodox. When I was in the United States, tragically, Martin Luther King was assassinated that year, and he said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And one of my things is I like things that matter, and I try to look at things that are relevant. And so I'm going to tell you the story of my academic career, tackling things which I thought are important, and fighting with groupthink. And I realize now I finally understand where groupthink comes and how powerful it is. And how I was also guilty of it. So the things that I've been interested in my career was the very first thing when I started in 1976, marathon runners immune from heart disease. That was a theory that came up then. I was interested in neck injuries in rugby, preventable in this country. We made a major change. I'm not going to talk about that more seriously. Does dehydration kill, or is it overhydration? Do we overdrink during exercise? Do carbohydrates give you energy? Everyone thinks that carbohydrates are the critical component for performance. Is that true? Should cyclists wear helmets? It's remarkable. We have a very famous race in South Africa, and I said that we should have helmets, and I was criticized for saying that because that took away the freedom of the cyclist. The next year they became mandatory within 1 year because we just were having so many deaths. Do the muscles regulate exercise performance? That's what you probably were taught. We'll go through that. Are professional rugby players overplayed in this country? In American football, you control it brilliantly. Your players are not overplayed in this country. It's a disaster. We have people playing for 11 months of the year, and it's absolutely impossible. They cannot survive that. Is it possible to swim 1 kilometer in minus 1.8 degrees in a Speedo? And then are low-fat diets healthy? Are the diets that we prescribe healthy? So I'm not going to go through all of them, but that's kind of it. This is, in 1977, James Fix wrote this book, The Complete Book of Running, and it became very popular. It sold over 1 million copies. That was really the start of the running craze. And tragically, he died of heart disease 7 years after this picture was taken. He had advanced coronary artery disease. But it was said at the time that if you ran marathons, you could not have a heart attack. And the very first paper, one of the first papers I published was certainly in the New England Journal of Medicine. We managed to find a group of marathon runners who had coronary artery disease and who died. And we published it there, and that proved that was not the case. And there was a lot of antagonism when we presented this because people thought we were against exercise and so on, but it wasn't the case at all. So that was a myth. The myth that you could just go and run a marathon and be cured for life was ridiculous. The next question I looked at was, what should you be drinking during exercise? And all of you, I know, believe that dehydration is very dangerous for your body and its health. So if you go back in history, you've got to ask, where does it start? Well, if you go back to 60 and 64, this is the first African to win Olympic gold medals, both in Tokyo and in Rome, and in Tokyo. And in Rome, he ran barefoot because his shoes wouldn't fit at the time. When he won the next 4 years later, he finished 3 minutes ahead of the second runner. He did calisthenics for 3 minutes while he waited for the second runner. In none of these races did he drink. It looks like he's sucking on something, but he didn't drink. He specifically said, I didn't drink. And before this race, he'd had his appendix removed 6 weeks before that race, but he still won in world record time. The reality is, when people were running in those days, they were not drinking anything at all. And that was the global standard. You didn't drink during exercise. It changed, and suddenly people started drinking more and more, and it became popular to drink, prescribe much more fluid ingestion during exercise. My life changed on June the 1st, 1981, when a lady started our 90-kilometer Comrades Marathon. It's an ultramarathon between Durban and Pietermaritzburg. And she started the race at 6 o'clock in the morning. Some hours later, she'd run 70 kilometers, and she couldn't recognize her husband. So he decided to take her out the race. And she was feeling really terrible. So he took her to the race finish, where the doctors examined her and said, well, you're dehydrated, you need fluid. So they gave her 2 liters of intravenous fluids, which made her feel worse. So the husband said, well, actually, you're looking worse. I think we better take her to hospital. So he put her in the car and started driving her back to the hospital in Durban. And halfway there, she had an epileptic seizure and went unconscious. And she was unconscious for 5 days. This is the first case in the world. And she wrote to me a few weeks later and said, what happened? And this, when she was admitted to hospital, that was her chest x-ray. She has pulmonary edema, and that's her chest x-ray 5 days later. It's normal. Now, fortunately, the doctor was well trained, and he knew that you measure blood to make sure that there are not too many abnormalities there. And her serum sodium concentration was 115, so she had hyponatremia, profound hyponatremia. And as you all know, 140 is normal, so she got down to 115. The question was, how? In 7 hours or 5 hours or 6 hours running, do you get from 140 down to 115? Because this is such a tightly regulated variable. And you can see that she recovered only after 4 days. The blood concentration come back to normal. And she said, what happened? Did I lose too much salt? Or what? And I said, I have no idea. So we eventually researched it, and a few years later, we went back to the race and we hospitalized 8 patients with profound hyponatremia after the race, and some of them were extremely sick. And we followed them in recovery and measured their fluid balance. And this is what we found. We essentially found that they were all fluid overloaded substantially, and that this worst athlete with the lowest sodium of about 112 was 6 liters overhydrated. And all of them, there's a linear relationship, and that has subsequently been shown repeatedly, that this is a disease of fluid retention. And it's very similar to what happens post-surgery, that these people, for some reason, have inappropriate ADH secretion, and they retain water and they drink, and they're not passing urine, so they presume they're dehydrated. And as a consequence, they eventually get cerebral edema and collapse. So we knew already in 1991 that this condition is due to fluid overload. And it happens if you tell people to drink too much, particularly if you tell them to drink ahead of thirst. And so how did the industry respond? Well, they said, research shows your body needs at least 40 ounces, that's 1.2 liters of fluid every hour, or your performance could suffer. And I've cut out the name so you don't know who it was. But this is bunkum. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. It's complete nonsense. 1.2 liters per hour is a huge amount. So eventually, I predicted in the early 1990s that women would die from this, because women are at real risk because they're running at the back of the race and they're told to drink and they follow instructions and they run slowly and they don't sweat, and that eventually happened. So this is what happened. The incidence, this is a cumulative number of cases of hyponatremia that I could trace in the medical literature, and in fact there's another 600 which were just recently been reported from the US military. So this is the number of a condition that's completely unnecessary, and these are the deaths. We've had 12 deaths, in fact there are more than that now. Every single one of them iatrogenic and unnecessary. And how did it happen? Well, the sports drink industry in the US begins in 1987 when Gatorade is bought by a new company. In my view, they influence the scientists not to see the literature properly. And the scientists start to say that the evidence is you must not lose any weight during exercise. So you must drink ahead of thirst to prevent weight loss. And they bring out their 2 guidelines. The American College of Sports Medicine brings out these 2 guidelines. Particularly these ones which say you must drink as much as tolerable. And that was a death sentence for a number of athletes. Cynthia Letero dies in the Boston Marathon in 2002. She drinks 1.2 liters per hour for 5 hours in a race that is run at 10 degrees, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees centigrade, with an oncoming wind and cloud cover. She's told she must drink 1.2 liters per hour for 5 hours to prevent heat stroke when she's barely running. And we eventually produced different guidelines, and those are now being accepted, that you drink to thirst. And the evidence is absolutely clear that your performance is optimized when you drink to thirst. And I eventually wrote a book on it. It took me 30 years from the time that I saw the first patient. And that exposes the false science in this bogus science. So this was a bogus science of hydration. There is no science of hydration. We evolve as long-distance runners with thirst, and if you drink to thirst, that's all you need. And you do not need to take sodium during exercise, and you probably don't need to take sugar, but that's another issue. So this was a bogus science, and the scientists were accountable, and they still don't recognize it. The ones who are accountable still do not recognize it. They shoot me as the messenger, but don't look into their own hearts. Do the muscles regulate exercise performance? What really interests me in sport is close finishes. And it doesn't matter if it's an individual sport like this or it's a team sport. Because what I believe happens in an event like this is he makes a decision to win. He's won by 6 inches. And this guy makes a decision to lose. And I know that sounds funny, but I'll give you the evidence. See, the normal argument is that your lactic acid builds up in your muscles. And so he's got more lactic acid in his muscles, so he can't run as fast as this guy. And the answer is that cannot be the explanation for very simple reasons. So here's the idea, you see, your heart can't pump enough blood to the muscles, they become anaerobic, and they produce lactic acid, and lactic acid poisons the muscles, so you stop. Now the problem with this model is it's brainless. It's got no brain. So it doesn't matter what you think. Fatigue is caused exclusively by failing muscles, so the brain cannot influence the exercise performance. So what you think is irrelevant. And all of you know, thinking is terribly important to the outcome of an event. But that's the point. Now, if this model is true, what it means is that the brain must have recruited all the motor units or the muscle fibers in that muscle. So that when you get exhausted, you recruited 100% of your muscle. And then the muscle's poisoned and you slow down. So it's really very simple to prove whether the model's true or not. All you have to do is measure EMG activity in muscles at exhaustion. And guess what? You never recruit more than about 50% of your muscles at exhaustion. So it doesn't matter how tired you're feeling. You're only recruiting 50%. 50% is not being used. Why not? Because the brain chooses not to, and I'll explain why. And we know that's true because if you take Haile Gebrselassie and you watch his running speed, here's his running speed, that's faster, that's slower. So he starts at a high pace, he drops a little bit, and then he speeds up. And his fastest is the finish. So he runs the last kilometer the fastest, and you all know that. If his muscles are so poisoned that they can't work any harder, you can't do that. And so that destroys the model. And what's actually happening here is that he is able to recruit more muscle in the last kilometer than in the first kilometer, and so he goes faster. So he might start off, let's say, at 45% of his muscle recruitment, and he finishes at 50%. So the success for this guy is that his brain can recruit more at the end. And what we've realized is that the recruitment is determined by a governor or regulator in the brain, which sets you off at this pace. On the basis of your ability and your physical condition at that time, and it works out that it'll only allow you to run at this speed until you get relatively close to the finish. And then it says, fine, the calculation's good, we've got a little bit of reserve, we'll allow you to go faster. And so you're able to speed up. And that's the model that we've developed. So the question, how can you run the fastest when he's the most fatigued? And the answer is, his muscles will indeed be fatigued, we know that. But he's yet able to recruit more of them and run faster. So the regulation sits up here, not down there. And if you extend that further, you could say, well, the person who can recruit the most will win. So why don't we all recruit even more and run faster? And that's a question we can't necessarily understand. So the answer is that the brain regulates exercise performance in a feed-forward mechanism, but there is feedback to the brain, informing the brain of how your condition is. And it's simple. These are studies which are in the literature. You run much better when you have competitors present. You run much better when you know where the end point is. You run much better if we deceive you. If we can make you believe you're better than you are, we can get you to run better. And if we can convince you to self-belief. So the deception, if we make you think the distance is different from what it is, or the time is different, we can improve. And if we make you believe differently. And when you start exercise, you choose a level of muscle recruitment determined by how far you have to go. So that's why we begin exercise at different intensities. We always have reserve. You are never activate all the fibers in the active muscles. Never. Except if there was some absolute crisis, you might, but in health, you don't. There's always an end spurt. All world records is an end spurt, so we know that that's part of the model. And then there's feedback, and there are thousands of feedbacks, but one of the obvious ones is heat. So in the laboratory, if we induce heat or increase the heat load, the athlete will slow down within 30 seconds. They will slow down. The body will pick up that this is a hotter environment. Or if you give them less oxygen, within 30 seconds they will slow down. They don't wait till they die and then slow down. They slow down in anticipation. So this is an anticipatory control. And it's a really important model because, as I'll come back to it, we now know fatigue is nothing but an emotion. So if you ever feel tired, it's just an emotion. It's not a physical event, and we'll talk about that. I had the privilege of going to the North Pole with Lewis Pugh, a Cape Town swimmer, and he wanted to swim 1 kilometer at the North Pole, and my job was to make sure he returned alive. And the reason is, at the North Pole, it's 4 kilometers deep, and if we lost him, he was going to be 4 kilometers at the bottom of the ocean, and I'd come back to Cape Town and no one would ever believe me again. It began when he said, "Can I swim around the Cape Peninsula?" And I said, "Yes." And he'd asked everyone else, and they'd said, "No, you can't do it." But I knew a bit of physiology, and so I was convinced that it is completely possible. The other people saw themselves and said, "I can't do it, therefore he can't do it." But they didn't understand the physiology. So he started right off here, just off the waterfront here, and it took him 13 days. He swam different distances, and he eventually arrived there. And what was really life-changing for me was when he arrived at the beach there in Muizenberg, he phoned me at my offices and he said, "Tim, I couldn't have done without you." So I said, "But I did nothing." He said, "No, you believed in me," and that was critical. And that was really an open. So then he asked, "Can I swim at 80 degrees north? What's the expected water temperature?" 0 to 5. I said, "I can't guarantee that you'll live." So anyway, we did some experiments and we had him swim at increasingly cold water by getting ice bars and filling them and allowing him to swim in these huge pools which were just full of ice. The ice was produced locally. And we showed that even down to 0 degrees, he could maintain his body temperature reasonably well for at least 20 minutes. So we went off to these we went off first to the Arctic, then we went down to the Antarctic, and then we went to the North Pole. And that's just to show that's what he swam in. He did not wear a wetsuit, which of course wouldn't make it a problem. And this is typically what happens. So he would enter the water and he'd swim for 20 minutes and his temperature would actually drop relatively little, which is quite remarkable. So this was a 1 kilometer swim in the Arctic, and then we would warm him up and he would get back. This was a swim in the Antarctic. It was the same. And then he wanted to do an epic swim. He wanted to swim a mile in the Arctic at 3 degrees. And what you see here is that while he was still in the water, his temperature started to drop dramatically. And he's becoming profoundly quite hypothermic. And it was interesting because I was watching every stroke and I could tell that something had happened. And fortunately, when I noticed that he only had 100 meters to go and the swim was ended, and you could see that he had quite a drop in temperature. And he was conscious, he remained conscious, but he was a little bit not fully lucid. And we warmed him up afterwards and he was fine. But here, on the experiment in the Antarctic, I put a muscle temperature probe into his muscles, vastus lateralis. And you can see it was 31 degrees when he came out of the water, and an hour later, it was still 31 degrees. So even though he'd been in a hot water bath and we got his temperature back to normal, his muscle temperature was still cold. So that just gives you an idea of how profoundly cold he was. And again shows you the idea that you protect the core and you leave your periphery to warm up. So here's a picture of him swimming at the North Pole. And in fact, we had 250 meters of open water and he did 4 lengths. And what was happening, because his skin temperature has 2 degrees centigrade, the water temperature is -1. His skin temperature is telling his brain, get out, get out, get out. That's all he's hearing from in his brain. And I told him, I said, "Lewis, you stay in and I'll tell you when to get out." But he had to believe me, and that was the relationship. So what we had to tell him was that you don't listen to what your brain's saying. That's the key. Don't listen to what your brain's saying. And that is what we teach our athletes now. We teach them fatigue is merely a sensation that the body uses to ensure that you do not kill yourself. As a result, however bad you feel, you always have reserve capacity. And so So I haven't got further time to go on about this fatigue, but this is a fundamental truth in biology, that exercise fatigue is there to make sure you don't kill yourself. That's what it's there for. And so we tell our athletes, you don't have to listen to it. You don't have to. You can ignore it. It's not a real phenomenon. And then the final thing is, what should we eat? And to me, this is the most compelling problem that we face. Now, I don't know what problems you have in orthopedics. Maybe the ACL is the critical issue. But globally, there is nothing bigger than what you eat. Nothing bigger. Because you know in the United States, going to refer to the United States, you know that your medical services are going to collapse in 2026 because there's not going to be money anymore because of two diseases, obesity and diabetes, and that's it. I was in the United States a few months ago, and a guy from Microsoft got up and said that the United States has 10 years to sort out its fiscal deficit, but it can't sort out its fiscal deficit unless it sorts out diabetes and obesity. It's got 10 years. So that's how important diabetes and obesity are to all of us. So my story is that my father died of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, had all the complications. I was a marathon runner, and I continue to run today, and run many races. I've run this race 10 times, and so I was the 15th guy ever to run it 10 times, so I got that number. And that was in the 70s right through to the 90s. And so I was very interested in sport and being healthy. And in 1977, these guys in the US got together and produced new eating guidelines for all of us. And I was the first to follow them because I'm going to be healthy. I'm going to follow what the Americans tell us to do. So, because you guys know, of course. And they told us we had to reduce our fat and switch from saturated fatty vegetables, etc. And only now do I know that this report was written by a junior staffer vegan who had no training in nutritional sciences. And only now after reading a book, Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, which is the most important book in medicine in the last 50 years. If you haven't read it, read it. Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. Gary Taubes is an astonishing writer, one of your very, very best. And he wrote this book, which will ultimately change the entire world. But at the moment, he's demonized, etc., but it is an astonishing book. And what he did was he just sat down for 6 years and said, I want to find out about nutrition. And he went on the internet and he studied all the science and all the books and all the history, and he came to the conclusion that we've been duped, that we've been fed a bunch of lies. That's the conclusion. So, and it begins with this committee, which really it's driven by commercial interest to produce corn and to sell corn, and that's it. And I don't want to go any further than that. So then we're told we must start eating these foods. We must eat, say, 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereals, rice, and pasta. Now come back to Africa 3 million years ago, and this wasn't around. That food only became available 12,000 years ago maximum. If you're like me from north of Europe, only 2,000 years ago did we start eating these grasses. And these are grasses, you must understand, grass. And humans are not grass eaters, we're meat eaters. And so we took out the foods that we were designed, perhaps by evolution, to eat, and we put these foods in their place. So now I wrote this book, which is quite well recognized, and I again was groupthink. I was guilty of profound groupthink. So what did I write? All athletes must eat high carbohydrate diets. High carbohydrate diets are now considered ideal for both health and sport. And the last edition of this was 2002. So up till 2002, I absolutely believed that this was the whole story. And eventually, I continued. I ran the Chicago Marathon with my daughter in 2006. So I've kept running, doing everything, and guess what? I get type 2 diabetes. And that made me ask questions. What have I done wrong? I've done the right diet, I've kept physically active, yet I get type 2 diabetes. So clearly something's wrong. And so then I go back and I read the books, and I read Gary Taubes' book, which kind of changes my whole perception. And Gary Taubes brings us back to Ansel Keys, who in 1953 publishes that article, suggesting a direct relationship between fat in the diet and the rates of heart disease. And he then draws the conclusion that it's the fat in the diet that causes heart disease. And but the problem was no one told us, and I wasn't told at medical school, that associational studies don't prove causation. And it turns out that at least 90% of the evidence for this diet is associational studies. In fact, 90% of the evidence that is used to tell us what we should be eating is associational studies, tragically. And someone recently said the naivety of such an interpretation of association or associated attributes is a classroom demonstration. In other words, we now know association proves nothing, but yet we've been told it wasn't. Well, some other good scientists from New York said, hold on, keys. There were actually a whole bunch of other countries that you ignored. Why didn't you include them? And for example, and what's really important is with the variance. That's the key, is the variance, not what sits on the line. And for example, France has a high rate of fat intake and low rates of heart disease, whereas Finland are the opposite. And the question is, so what's the difference between Finland and France that explains this huge difference? And the answer is the French eat lots of saturated fat and other things which might be protective rather than hurting it. And so the guys said evidence from the 22 countries indicates that the association between fat calories and mortality from heart disease is not valid. That's what they said in 1957. The association is specific neither for dietary fat nor for heart disease. Clearly, this tenuous association cannot serve as much support for the hypothesis which implicates fat as an etiological factor, etc. So I did not understand that it was an associational study alone that made the US guidelines change from high fat to high carbohydrate. So we pulled out the fat out of the diet as a consequence of that. And it's even more interesting because Gary Taubes digs in further, and he said in 1957 the American Heart Association concluded that Keyes' hypothesis was not credible. They said, Keyes, you're wrong, it can't be true, it's associational. And 4 years later they changed, they reversed completely. Why? Because Keyes went onto the committee and changed the opinion. And so that was the end of that. There were many dissenting voices, and George Mann was one of them, and he came to Africa. He went to see the Kenyans, the Masai, because he knew the Masai they're pastoralists, they live on cattle, and they had a very high saturated fat intake. He found their cholesterols were normal, they had no heart disease. But as soon as they moved to the towns, they developed heart disease. Absolutely the same in South Africa. And he said saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet are not the cause of heart disease. The myth is the greatest scientific deception of the century, perhaps of any century. One day the true cause of heart disease will be found and the disorder will be prevented. When this happens, Keyes and his cronies will be exposed. And that day is coming, because unfortunately, it is the greatest scam. It's an astonishing scam. And all I can tell you is I've spent 3 years researching it, and I'll put my life on it, that's the greatest scam in medicine. That fat in the diet prevents or protects against heart disease. It doesn't. And we managed to get completely the wrong message out there. And what was the consequence? Because what we did, we took fat out of the diet, we replaced it with carbohydrate, and now we know what the consequences were. This is the NHANES data, fabulous data, and it shows that from 1960 to 1978, obesity rates in the men in the United States and in the women were relatively low and stable. And from the moment the guidelines were introduced, the obesity has increased. We know that the obesity epidemic starts in 1980, not in 1960, not in 1970, in 1980. And there are other data which absolutely confirm this. Population studies in other cities in the United States looking at children cohorts, they're all fine until 1980, and then they take off. So we know the cause. And the explanation is also, the biological explanation is also simple. And Gary Taubes makes this he discovers this fantastic story, that until the Second World War, we were told that obesity is caused by high carbohydrate diets acting through insulin secretion. It was a model developed by the German scientists in Austria and in Germany. And at the end of the Second World War, because Germany lost the war, all that information was lost and suppressed. And an alternate model, that it's calories in, calories out, that we're just too lazy and we don't expend enough energy and we eat too much, that model became the dominant model. And the German model was thrown out. And now we only have one model. The German model is simply this, that carbohydrates play a special role in obesity. And this is only one component of it, there's more to it. But when you take in carbohydrates, particularly glucose, in my view, this is my explanation, glucose is highly toxic for the body. And that is why we regulate it so tightly. Why we keep it at 5 millimolar. Because it's so toxic. And we regulate it with insulin secretion. So we secrete insulin to get the glucose down again. And insulin prompts fat cells to accumulate fat. Insulin is the fat-building hormone. You all know that because diabetics without insulin become thin and die. And you have to have insulin. So insulin does two things. It drives carbohydrate into the fat cells as fat, and it prevents the fat coming up. You cannot oxidize fat if you've got insulin circulating. But much more importantly, carbohydrates drive hunger. So the data I haven't got show you the Americans are eating more carbohydrate than also ingesting more calories. And it looks like as if fat and protein act differently in the body. Not only don't they cause insulin secretion, or to the same extent, but they waste calories. You just don't get the same amount of calories when you eat fat and protein. And the interesting thing is, although this was the standard treatment and the standard teaching, currently no medical school in the world teaches both this model of obesity. They all teach the calories in, calorie out model. And I'm sure in your hospitals, when you've got patients who are fat, that's what they're told. You have to get out and exercise and so on. Those who don't teach the energy balance model are ostracized, and that is groupthink. And so we have this remarkable thing that we teach one model, it doesn't work, you can't lose weight on that model, and yet we continue to sustain it. So what I've now been looking at, and the evidence, the scientific evidence that taking fat out the diet and replacing it with carbohydrates was a total disaster. And in my opinion, humans are designed to burn fat and to live on fat and protein and a little bit of carbohydrate. And particularly if you're insulin resistant like myself. If you're insulin resistant, you cannot metabolize carbohydrate at more than about 25 grams a day. So the advice we give now is that we like to know, is a patient insulin resistant? If they are, they've got to cut the carbohydrates way down to get the insulin down. And then they will be successful, they'll be healthy. And it's my opinion that insulin resistance is the key driver of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, and hypertension. And that they're all driven by insulin resistance and a high carbohydrate diet. So if you've got hypertension and you treat it with hypertensive drugs, it's a complete waste of time. You've got to take the carbohydrates out of the diet. And the results are dramatic. My blood pressure dropped about 20 millimeters of mercury, just like that, by cutting the carbs. And we see it in so many people. I mean, again, I'm talking anecdote, but there are 23 randomized controlled clinical trials with high-fat diets. And they show that they reverse all coronary risk factors, all of them. Whereas a high carbohydrate diet either doesn't change them or it makes them worse. And we're not told that. And those trials are out there. Okay. So, challenging beliefs, my story. 50% of what we teach is wrong. The problem is we don't know which 50% it is. And the biggest lie we teach students today is that carbohydrates are healthy and fats are unhealthy. That is the biggest lie we teach. And we will have to change. And we will have to change that it's the fats that cause disease. The educated person spends a lifetime trying to figure out which 50% is which. Until it's disproven, this is kind of my advice. Except that for which the evidence appears solid and logical is free of covert or overt conflicts of interest, because the conflicts of interest are astonishing. As you know, the lobby groups in Washington are a real issue. Don't ever dismiss lightly that for which there is credible evidence, and that's reverse gullibility. So there is a huge amount of evidence that cutting carbohydrates out of the diet is healthy and beneficial, but we don't accept that. We say, well, there's not enough evidence, and that's called reverse gullibility. And question everything else, and eventually the truth always prevails. So in the end, as I said, the lie in life, you must go for the truth, because that will be sustained for life. What the professor believes could be wrong next week. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a great question.